While Western Europe threw its doors open in 2015, Poland refused to follow and changed the locks instead. Picture the EU as one shared house. Other flatmates propped the front door, but Warsaw kept checking every ID at its own. In 2017, Poland rejected the EU's mandatory relocation quota outright. By 2022, it had finished a 186-kilometer wall along the Belarus border. By October 2026, checkpoints on the German and Lithuanian borders still stand, even under a pro-EU government. Is Poland still Europe's outsider? Or vindicated? That question starts 9 years earlier, where the outsider label was first pinned on Poland. Europe was living through its largest movement of people since the Second World War, more than 1 million arrivals in 2015 alone, most fleeing war in Syria and crossing through an overwhelmed Balkan route while Frontex struggled to count them. Hungary's government, led by Viktor Orban, had already sealed its border with Serbia that same September with a razor wire fence, shutting down the main overland route through the Balkans and pushing the flow toward Croatia and Slovenia instead. Germany's Angela Merkel had thrown the continent's biggest door wide open. Greece and Italy, stuck processing almost everyone under the EU's first entry rule, wanted the burden spread around. So in September 2015, the EU Council votes to relocate 160,000 asylum seekers across member states, calling it Solidarity. Poland's outgoing government, weeks from an election it will lose, provisionally agrees to take roughly 6,182 of them. PiS wins Poland's election in October 2015 after a campaign that leaned hard into fear of the newcomers, and within days, the incoming government signals it has no intention of honoring what its predecessor just signed. Poland has not taken a single migrant under the deal yet, and it is already cast as the reluctant partner in the room. Reluctance becomes policy fast. Poland accepts only a handful of its roughly 6,182 quota commitment. It does not act alone. Hungary and Slovakia refuse relocation too, and the Czech Republic drags its feet as well. The same Central European bloc that had watched the original 2015 vote get pushed through over its objections by majority rule rather than consensus. Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico, called the quota system nonsensical and offered instead to accept a few hundred migrants, provided they were Christian. 3, sometimes 4, capitals now bet that numbers offer safety from Brussels. Brussels responds the only way institutions know how, with paper. The European Commission opens infringement proceedings against Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 2017, betting legal pressure will succeed where political persuasion already failed. Warsaw does not budge an inch. The case heads to the EU's top court, and the clock on enforcement starts ticking, slowly, the way EU law usually does. That ticking clock is worth understanding, because Brussels sues Poland undersells what happened. The European Commission followed the EU's standard 3-step process: a letter of formal notice, a reasoned opinion when Warsaw ignored it, then referral to the Court of Justice. Poland's defense leaned on Article 72 of the EU treaty, the clause letting states protect security and public order. The court's Advocate General had signaled skepticism, noting a blanket refusal is a different thing from case-by-case security screening. Advocate General Eleanor Sharpston, a British jurist who would lose her own post months later in a dispute tied to Brexit, delivered that opinion on October 31st, 2019, giving the judges nearly 6 months to weigh it before ruling. The judges agreed. But agreeing on the law and being able to enforce it turned out to be 2 separate problems, and Brussels never solved the second one. The clock runs out slower than anyone in Brussels expected, and by the time it does, the ruling barely matters. The European Court of Justice rules on April 2nd, 2020, that Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic broke EU law by refusing relocation between 2015 and 2017, rejecting Warsaw's argument that national security let it opt out entirely. It sounds decisive. It is not. No fines are issued because the Commission never asks for penalty payments once the scheme has already expired. No enforcement mechanism follows. The relocation program has already collapsed in practice, replaced by ad hoc, bilateral deals, a pandemic dominating headlines, and diplomatic silence on the original quota fight. Poland loses the case on paper and loses nothing real. In the shared house, someone finally got a ruling that the door should have stayed open 5 years after everyone else had stopped using that door. Before the ruling's ink is dry, the argument stops being about paperwork and becomes something more physical. From summer 2021, Belarus's Lukashenko regime, freshly hit with EU sanctions over a stolen election and a brutal crackdown on protesters, starts flying migrants from the Middle East and Africa into Minsk on tourist visas, then busing and marching them toward the Polish border. It is retaliation dressed up as a humanitarian gesture, and EU officials call it exactly what it is: hybrid warfare. One group of Afghan migrants gets stranded for weeks at Usnar's Gorny, camped in no man's land while Poland refuses entry and Belarusian guards refuse to let them go back. Poland declares a state of emergency in the border zone on September 2nd, 2021, and locks out journalists and aid groups along with the migrants, drawing criticism from press freedom monitors. By November 2021, more than 4,000 people, many from Iraqi Kurdistan, had massed at the Kuzhnica crossing alone, and Iraq suspended most flights to Minsk that month under EU pressure, choking off the route's main supply line. Within months, thousands of crossing attempts are recorded, families stranded in freezing forest between two lines of fencing neither government will let them cross. Human rights monitors will document dozens of deaths in that forest over the following years. This is not a quota dispute anymore. This is a border under deliberate assault, and Warsaw treats it as one. Warsaw's answer to an engineered crisis is physical, not rhetorical. Poland builds a barrier 186 kilometers long, standing about 5.5 meters tall, cutting straight through part of Białowieża, one of Europe's last primeval forests, which draws environmental backlash alongside the security praise. It costs roughly 1.6 billion zloty and is completed in June 2022, fast for a project of that scale. Steel, not statements. Brussels will not help pay for it. The European Commission's long-standing position was that EU funds should not go toward walls and fences, so Poland foots the bill entirely from its own budget, a grievance Warsaw repeats for years afterward. Where other capitals kept debating resettlement formulas in Brussels conference rooms, Poland poured concrete footings and welded sensor-lined panels. The wall does not end the crossings entirely. Smugglers adapt, routes shift east toward Lithuania and Latvia, but it ends the ambiguity about where Poland's line sits. Everyone, including Minsk, now knows exactly what crossing that line requires. Even while that wall was still going up, Poland was proving it never had a problem with refugees in general, only with Brussels telling it how many to take and when. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine begins in February 2022, and within weeks, Poland takes in millions of Ukrainians, more than any quota negotiation ever asked of it, with no EU mandate forcing the decision and little domestic backlash. Warsaw sets up reception points, waives paperwork, lets Ukrainian children into Polish schools within days. The contrast is not subtle. And Poland does not pretend otherwise. This was solidarity offered on its own terms, to neighbors fleeing a war on Poland's own doorstep, not a formula imposed from Brussels for faraway conflicts. Warsaw had no say in judging. Critics call the double standard uncomfortable. Poland calls it consistency. It decides who comes in, on what terms, at its own door, exactly the point it was making back in 2015. That same argument Poland had been making since 2015 finally gets put to a formal vote. On October 15th, 2023, a referendum question on the EU's forced relocation mechanism goes to the public alongside parliamentary elections, one of 4 referendum questions on the same ballot that day. The other 3 questions that day asked voters about selling state assets, raising the retirement age, and removing the border barrier itself. Migration drew the highest turnout of the 4. Over 96% of those who answer the migration question reject it outright. Nationwide turnout lands short of the 50% threshold Polish law requires for a binding result, so technically it changes nothing on paper. Politically, that barely registers. It is the first time the quota fight is handed straight to voters rather than settled quietly between governments and courts, and the government treats the number, not the technicality, as the mandate. Poland is not just refusing anymore. It is turning refusal into a message aimed squarely at Brussels. That message outlives the election that carried it, which is the part almost nobody predicted correctly. Donald Tusk becomes Prime Minister on December 13th, 2023, replacing the PiS government that built the wall and staged the referendum. His coalition ran on the opposite brand from its predecessor. Pro-EU, committed to the rule of law, promising a return to Brussels' good graces after years of frozen recovery funds worth over 100 billion euros and bitter disputes over judicial independence. Everyone assumes the border posture will soften along with the rhetoric. It does not. The Belarus wall stays standing. The hardline posture stays intact, partly because Tusk's coalition includes an agrarian, more nationalist wing that would not tolerate a retreat. In the shared house, a new tenant moves in loudly, promising to leave the door unlocked, and then quietly keeps the deadbolt where it was. Tusk's government does not just maintain the old policy either, it sharpens it. In June 2024, the Polish parliament and President Duda approve a law allowing the temporary suspension of the right to asylum for what Poland calls instrumentalized migration at the Belarus border. UNHCR and rights groups call it a breach of international obligations, and Polish monitoring groups documenting pushbacks at the fence call it worse, a legal shield for practices under challenge in court. Poland does not dispute the legal tension the law creates. It refuses to treat this as an ordinary migration policy choice, framing it instead as a security necessity that overrides the asylum guarantees when the crossings are engineered by a hostile state next door. A government elected to make Poland look less like an outlier now owns the hardest line Poland has taken yet. Then the argument turns inward, aimed at the EU's core rather than its eastern edge. Germany reintroduces controls on all its land borders in September 2024, an admission from Berlin under Interior Minister Nancy Faeser, and with the far-right AfD rising in the polls after a string of attacks blamed on failed asylum cases, that its migration math is not holding either. Poland does not treat this as vindication and quietly let it pass. From July 7th, 2025, Poland imposes reciprocal spot checks on its border with Germany, citing secondary migration and what it calls German pushbacks of migrants shuttled back across the line onto Polish soil. The flatmate who once propped the shared door wide open is now finding Polish officers checking IDs on the way back in. The irony is not lost on anyone, least of all Warsaw. While Poland and Germany check each other's paperwork at a border that used to need none of it, Brussels is rewriting the house rules to match Warsaw's habits. The EU's new pact on migration and asylum passes the European Parliament in April 2024 and is set to apply from June 2026. It bundles mandatory screening of every arrival at the external border, faster asylum procedures processed right there instead of inside the continent for claims with low odds of approval, and a solidarity mechanism letting reluctant member states pay into a common fund or offer other support instead of physically accepting relocated migrants. That payment option is the opt-out Poland spent a decade demanding and getting threatened with lawsuits over, now written into EU law for every member state. No exceptions needed because the exception became the rule. The whole shared house is adopting Warsaw's habit of checking every ID at its own door. The pact Brussels lands on is not one law, but 5 linked ones, and the details matter more than the headline. The Asylum and Migration Management Regulation replaces the old Dublin system that dumped responsibility on first entry states like Greece and Italy, the unfairness that triggered the 2015 quota fight. The screening regulation mandates identity, security, and health checks at the external border before anyone moves further into the bloc. A crisis and force majeure regulation gives states extra fast-track powers during exactly the kind of engineered surge Belarus threw at Poland in 2021, powers Poland lobbied hard for. None of that existed in 2015. All of it exists because 2015 happened, and because the states that refused to accept the first plan kept making noise until the second one looked more like what they wanted. That second plan is now written into law, and by October 2026, the picture on the ground has not softened. It has spread outward across the continent. Poland's checkpoints on the German border, running since July 2025, and on the Lithuanian border, facing the same hybrid pressure route Belarus opened in 2021, remain active, spot checks on vehicles and documents rather than a sealed line, but a real departure from 3 decades of open Schengen travel. Warsaw's stated reasons stay consistent across both. Illegal migration and security concerns now folded into a broader warning about hybrid threats linked to Belarus and, increasingly, Russia. What has changed is the company Poland keeps while doing this. France, Austria, Denmark, and other Schengen states have also reimposed internal border checks over the same period, some citing terrorism risk, some citing the secondary movement complaint Poland has been making for years. What looked like Polish exceptionalism in 2021 reads, by 2026, like a continent-wide retreat from open borders, with Poland as an early adopter. Lithuania's experience makes the same point from a different angle. Vilnius faced its own version of the Belarus squeeze, starting in 2021, smaller in scale than Poland's, but the same playbook. Migrants funneled toward the border as leverage, and it responded with its fence and its emergency powers rather than waiting for a Brussels formula to arrive. By the time Poland's checkpoints with Lithuania are still running in October 2026, the two countries are not policing each other out of suspicion. They are coordinating against the same source of pressure sitting on both their borders. That is the detail that separates 2026 from 2015. Back then, Poland's refusal looked like a country breaking from its neighbors. By 2026, the neighbors are the ones who understand it best. Understanding why the neighbors get it now means understanding what Schengen promised in the first place. Since 1995, the promise of the zone was that once you crossed into it, internal borders effectively disappeared. No passport checks between Warsaw and Berlin. That promise is what makes every one of these checkpoints newsworthy rather than routine. Reintroducing controls is technically allowed only as a temporary, exceptional measure under Schengen's rules, renewed again rather than declared permanent. Poland's checks, Germany's checks, France's checks. All of them lean on that same temporary label while running for years, not weeks, which tells you more about where EU policy has landed than any communiqué does. That pattern is not cosmetic. It is a rewritten balance of power inside the EU. The pact replaces mandatory relocation with flexible solidarity contributions, exactly the kind of opt-out Poland was threatened with infringement proceedings for demanding a decade earlier. A new EU-wide emphasis on faster returns of rejected asylum seekers now targets a deportation rate that has hovered near just 20%. Undercut for years by origin countries refusing to take people back and by claims dragged out through repeated appeals, treating follow-through on removals as seriously as the arrival paperwork for the first time in the bloc's history. Positions that isolated Poland in 2015 and 2017, that got it dragged to Luxembourg and formally condemned, are now the architecture of EU-level policy design. The shared house did not evict the tenant who kept locking the door. It copied his lock and put one on every room. Not everyone calls this progress. Human rights organizations that spent a decade criticizing Poland for the same border tactics now level identical criticism at the EU pact, warning that faster border procedures mean faster rejections with less time to build a genuine asylum case, and that a bloc obsessed with screening and returns is abandoning the protection half of the word asylum. Poland's answer has not changed since 2021. A border under sustained pressure from a hostile neighbor is not the place to relitigate abstract principles. Security comes first, and the numbers? Thousands of attempted crossings, a war next door in Ukraine, drone incidents blamed on Russia, back that argument up more than any op-ed does. Both arguments are still standing in 2026, which is why the fight never ended. It just moved from Warsaw's border to every border. He, outsider, became Europe's blueprint. Poland's refusal to accept the 2015 quota drew infringement threats from Brussels and a formal condemnation from Europe's top court in 2020. By 2026, EU policy mirrors the screening, hard border, and returns focus that Poland was pushing when doing so cost it political capital and international goodwill it never got back. Its checkpoints on the German and Lithuanian borders are still standing this October, still justified on security grounds, no longer the exception inside Schengen, but close to the rule other governments now reach for first. Was Poland right to hold the line while the rest of Europe spent a decade calling it stubborn? Or did it get lucky that the continent drifted its way? Tell us which side of that door you would have stood on back in 2015, down in the comments. And if stories like this are your thing, stick around and subscribe for more.